Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another event in the Royal Institute of Philosophy Dundee Philosophy Speaker Series. My name is Frank Kruder. I'm a professor for modern and contemporary philosophy here at the University of Dundee, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Javi Carell. She is professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol. She studied for a BA and MA, if I'm not misinformed, at Tel Aviv University, and received her PhD from the University of Essex. She was a lecturer at the University of West of England and then moved to the University of Bristol, where she is now a professor of philosophy. Just to very briefly mention some of the very important and far-reaching, I think, absolutely, I mean, we're in the UK, and if a research actually has impact, there's no question that Javi Carell's research is that kind of research. I just want to mention briefly her very influential Illness, The Cry of the Flesh, I think, which was originally published in 2008 by Acumen, then re-edited by Routledge in 2013. And I think there is even a third edition now out. Then in 2014, Life and Death in Freud and Heidegger, and 2018, they're also hugely influential. Phenomenology of Illness. Javi Carell will speak to us for a bit, and then afterwards, she is kind enough to discuss with us for a bit. So I shut up now so that we get to the reason why we're all here. Thank you very much for being with us, Javi Carell. The floor is yours. She's going to speak to us under the title Illness, a Philosophical Method.
Thank you very much. Frank, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the lovely introduction. So I should just start by saying that I had a 2-hour lecture just before this, and I'm also just recovering from pneumonia. So I will do my best to talk for as long as, well, not as long as I can, but hopefully to do the full talk. But then afterwards, it would really help me if we have like a little break, maybe 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
A bit of a breather, and then we can go on to the discussion and see where that gets us to, if that's okay. So absolutely. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, can you let me share my screen, Frank?
Yes. Yes, should work now.
Thinking about it.
Yes, you can see it.
So can you see the screen okay?
Yes, we can see the slides. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as Frank mentioned, I spent quite a bit of time trying to do a philosophical analysis of illness experience, of the phenomenology of it, of the social aspects of it, the temporal aspects of it, using, very familiar philosophical tools, such as phenomenology, some frameworks taken from Heidegger on death, some sort of metaphysical concepts and ideas. And then after doing that for quite a while, I suddenly started thinking that we should also look not just at what philosophy can do to illuminate illness, but what illness can do to illuminate philosophy. And it occurred to me that illness can be thought of, or at least I suggest it can be thought of, as a type, if you indulge me, of philosophical method, and more specifically of phenomenological method. And that's really what the talk is about, to try and explain and fill in in as much detail as I can this proposition that illness can be thought of as a phenomenological method, and hence as a philosophical method, and hence as an element that can contribute greatly to philosophical thinking and work. So why is illness philosophically significant? For quite a few reasons, which I'll describe to you now. But first, I should probably say that when I use the term illness, I'm using it as a shorthand term to denote serious illness or life-changing illness. So I'm not talking here about, chipping a tooth or having a cold or spraining your ankle. Things that are simple and transient and ones that you expect full recovery from are, I think, quite profoundly different from the types of illness I'm talking about here, namely life-changing, profoundly debilitating, life-shortening, seriously impeding on the people who fall ill. So that kind of illness, I think, is very straightforwardly described as profound and life-changing. So people who become, debilitated through some kind of illness, usually experience that transformation as life-changing. And it has been discussed in the philosophical literature and also in pathographic literature as being indeed profoundly unsettling for people who fall ill and to those around them. The reason it is so profoundly life-changing is because one thing illness does, it calls on the person who is ill to reconsider their values and goals. Often these have to be adapted, changed, withdrawn, updated, and so on. And so, through this reconsideration of values and goals, one thing that happens very naturally when people fall ill is that they begin to reflect more broadly on their life and how they've lived up until now. So illness also invites us or calls upon us to be reflective with respect to the illness and also more broadly, because we have to reconsider how we live and how we want to live, what is important to us and what is negligible, what is intrinsic to our new situation and what is contingent, and so on. I think it not just calls on us to reflect, but in fact, it's a forceful invitation to reflect. What I'm trying to capture by this phrasing of forceful invitation is to say, yes, it's an invitation. Not everybody is compelled to reflect, but it's also very forceful. So it's not an invitation in the sense that, if you take a philosophy undergraduate degree, you can say, studying these questions invited me to reflect on metaphysics or ethics or whatever. But it's actually quite forceful in the sense that the change is foisted upon the ill person and the people who are close to him or her. Now, part at least of the reason why it is such a forceful invitation to reflect is because it's a largely negative and painful experience. And I think largely negative and painful experience are often ones that can, at least in some respects, be edifying. And Ian Kidd has a 2012 paper called Can Illness Be Edifying?, in which he makes precisely this claim, that out of the trials and challenges of human existence can arise an edifying response or an edifying experience that comes out of that. And indeed, I do think that the experience of falling ill can be both edifying and life-affirming, partly because when we fall ill, we discover the flexibility and adaptability that we are very naturally endowed with. And it helps us to be able to see that other life forms, for example, being disabled, for example, having an uncertain prognosis, for example, having to restrict one's daily activities, are not a complete retraction of the possibility of a good life. In other words, one thing that illness can do is make us reassess and indeed broaden our understanding of what a good human life is, or see new possibilities for flourishing that may seem to the healthy outsider as impossible or almost contradiction in terms. And indeed, I think one other way in which illness can contribute to philosophy is because illness and maybe other instances of physical and mental disability actually call upon us to broaden our understanding of the good life, to relativize some of the judgments we make about what qualifies as a good life, or what counts as a meaningful life, or what counts as flourishing. So illness can teach us, or can forcefully invite us to see that flourishing is possible, even when health and freedom from disability and pain is absent. So, can we think of illness as part of a phenomenological practice? I think we can, and I think that this kind of reflexive process that I was describing in the previous slide can actually be part of phenomenological method in ways that I'll enumerate in a minute. I also think that illness can be seen as a limit case that reveals to us new aspects and indeed the boundaries of human experience, because in some extreme cases it can take away from us everything that we hold dear, and nonetheless we still see human spirit maybe not entirely flourishing, but continuing undiminished despite the very severe limitations. And just as an example, I'll have a slide on this a bit later on. If we take something like locked-in syndrome, which was famously depicted by Jean-Dominique Bauby in his memoir called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, he was paralyzed completely in his entire body. The only part of himself he could move was his left eyelid. And that's why it's called locked-in syndrome, because it's almost impossible to see traces of consciousness in people with the syndrome. And even in that extreme limit case, Jean-Dominique Bauby was able to dictate his memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, to a nurse in this painstaking method where she held up a chart with letters on it, and he would blink every time she got to the letter he wanted her to note down. And he dictated to her an entire book, short, but nonetheless an entire book that was also made into a film directed by Julian Schnabel. So even in those limit cases, there is so much we can learn about human experience, because the richness of the experience is not diminished by the limitations to, for example, our body in the case of locked-in syndrome. And again, the reflection that I mentioned in the previous slide is not just a reflection on illness, but also on finitude, on what it means to be unable to do something, on the nature of suffering, on injustice within healthcare and also in other dimensions of human life, etc. And the final reason why I think illness is a philosophical tool, if you like, is because we can use lots of cases of illness, aberration, accident, trauma, any type of affliction really that affects human life, to test our conventional views about, again, what the good life means, what flourishing means, what is tolerable to us as humans. So in what ways is illness relevant to reflection? First, I think it's uniquely placed in its ability to reveal to us embodied experience that otherwise goes unnoticed. And that's because it broadens the spectrum of experience. So bodily, so experiences like having a stroke, having locked-in syndrome, suddenly becoming unable to use a certain part of your body, becoming helpless in the many of the relevant ways in which bodies become helpless, and having our bodies fail us, takes human experience and broadens it a lot, because these types of somatic experiences are entirely foreign to those who are healthy. And so the spectrum of experience, again, goes up right against the limit of, bodily survival, of physiological survival in cases of extreme illness. So it broadens our spectrum of bodily experience and also of mental experiences. If we take mental disorder symptoms such as hallucinations, voice hearing, we can also take those to convey to us and broaden to us the spectrum of mental experiences, because they are so far removed from what we normally experience. Okay, it's important also to say I'm not using the term normal to denote, it's not a normative claim of how it's better to be normal in some respect. I mean normal here just in the sense of what is statistically more common. So what illness does is introduces to our spectrum of experiences, both somatic and mental, the pathological domain, the place where things go wrong, where body parts and systems cease to function as we expect them to, where bodily uncertainty becomes much more prevalent and much more worrying. So we're moving away from the familiar, the certain, the everyday, the habitual, to the pathological domain, where increased disability, pain, bodily betrayal, bodily failure are much more common. Now that can achieve two things. First, it can illuminate to us the pathological domain, but also those kinds of experiences shed light on normal experience. Insofar as my stomach digests the soup I've eaten today without giving me any particular disturbing or novel experiences, I pay no attention to my digestive system. So it is only when things go wrong that all of a sudden we shine the light on that experience and naturally contrast it with the normal, unnoticed, taken for granted experience, say, of normal digestion or normal walking or normally being conscious or normally being able to see and hear and so on. Another sense in which the pathological domain is important is because it is an integral part of life. And it's an integral part of life when we look at life across the life cycle. So if we consider ourselves as existing from birth to death, there will be parts of life, for example, during and immediately after birth and during infancy, where helplessness and dependence on others is an entirely the entirely prevailing feature of that kind of existence. And again, if we look to end of life, we become helpless once more, vulnerable once more, and dependent on others once more. However, the space in between is not one that is entirely free of vulnerability. Quite the contrary. It is a space within which our vulnerability to external events, to affliction, to trauma, to accident, to mishaps, ranging from natural disasters to political unrest, mean that we are much more in the hands of contingent luck than we care to admit. And that contingency, I think, very profoundly links up with the bodily vulnerability that illness makes salient to us so clearly. As as Herodotus wrote when he recounts the encounter between Solon and King Croesus, the king of Lydia, man is all accident. And I love this pithy formulation, because when we say man or persons, humans are all accident, what we mean is that our openness and our vulnerability to unexpected and uncontrollable life events is much greater than the ability to control our environment and what befalls us. And finally, illness is also essential to consideration of the good human life. There are a lot of accounts of the good human life that present health as a sine qua non of the good life. I think that's an unnecessarily narrow understanding of the good human life. And I think that we need to think about the prevalence of chronic illness in adults. I think it's almost 50 or 60% of adult Americans, and a smaller but also very significant number of UK adults have at least one chronic condition they live with. So we can't just shut the door in the face of illness and say, a good life is not possible here, flourishing is not possible here. Rather, on the contrary, what we need to do is go and revisit our conception of the good life and make it more varied, more inclusive, less dogmatic. How does illness become salient to us? In one of two ways. It can be a sudden and severe disruption, or it can be a form of life. I'll start with the first. So a sudden and severe disruption, here I'm thinking about things like fast progressing cancer, a stroke, or a cardiac arrest. Something that is foreign, threatening, disruptive. Something that suddenly descends on us from the outside and disrupts everyday life. And in that disruption, it makes visible the very structure of everyday life that may have gone unnoticed or been only tacitly perceived previously. This disrupts that taken for grantedness that we rely on so much in our habitual and everyday routines. However, illness can also creep up on us as in a slowly progressing or gradual onset of a chronic condition. And as Sean Gallagher says, illness either sneaks up on us or we become so habituated to it that it defines our form of life. It becomes us or we become it. So in this second form of salience, illness simply becomes the thing that shapes our life, but it can do so gently, gradually. So we become, as he says, habituated to it. It is not a foreign, threatening explosion or sudden health event. It is something that descends on us more gradually and then can end up giving our life a particular form. So my proposal here is that illness is a kind of phenomenological reduction or epoché. And I'll flesh this out now in the next few slides. So the phenomenological reduction takes us from objects of perception to acts of perception. It's not a skeptical move. It doesn't involve us ceasing to perceive or denying the reality of the world, but is a shift in our way of being that enables us to reflect, to move from some sort of naive, if you like, or natural way of perceiving things to a more philosophical perspective that is more questioning and reflective. So moving, if you like, from a natural attitude to a more critical or philosophical attitude. In the reduction, our natural attitude is suspended, and with it are suspended our underlying metaphysical beliefs. In other words, as Zahavi says, we neutralize our belief in the existence of the world or in the existence of an object, or bracket our realist assumptions about that. Now, the point of the reduction is not to deny, doubt, neglect, abandon, or exclude reality from our research, but simply to suspend or neutralize a certain dogmatic attitude towards reality. So it's this suspension of the dogmatic attitude, the throwing into questioning that illness can do. This is where I'm starting to draw out the parallels between the phenological reduction and illness. It's a withdrawal from our ordinarily implicit commitment to the reality of the world, of thinking of it as being thus. And what happens when we withdraw this commitment is that under-theorized aspects of our experience can become an object of inquiry. We wonder, why does the world appear to us as it does? Why do I experience temporality in this particular way, and so on? It shifts our attention from a given object to the way in which it's given and its mode of appearance to us. So the epoché for Husserl is this bracketing of the natural attitude. The bracketing of this taken for granted, meaning-laden, metaphysically determined way of experiencing, which dislodges our everyday habits and invites, or in Husserl's case, is utilized in order to reflect. Again, it's not a removal from the world, but a shift in our way of being in the world that enables this kind of reflection. Oops. Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. So again, this is not akin to a skeptical procedure. It is a shift from the natural to the critical attitude in which we inhibit or put out of play the natural attitude, which exposes, as Husserl says in Cartesian Meditations, by pure living, the universe of phenomena. Now, Zahavi describes this epoché as an entry gate to reflection. And I was really struck by this expression, entry gate, and thought it is really similar to thinking about this idea of a forceful invitation of illnesses opening up, inviting us to reflect on why we live as we live, what are the things that matter to us, what are the values that remain steady, how do we carry on living with the disability and the limitations of illness. So reflection in illness is forced upon the real person, the ill persons, and compels them to modify and re-examine. Now, this is very different to this kind of, so this image is, it's a seminar, philosophy seminar, probably a good 70 years ago, in which the invitation to philosophize is very intellectual, is very academic, and can be refused quite easily by simply walking out of the room. Illness, on the other hand, is violent, and as a violent invitation or violent invitation to reflect, it doesn't give us the luxury of walking away from it in the way we could walk away from a philosophy seminar. So what kind of invitation to reflect or to philosophize is illness? Well, it's an invitation to reflect because it stabilizes the structure of experience. It uncovers our being by pushing it to its limits. And it forces us to look at our finitude, our disability, and alienation and objectification as extreme modes of being that are extreme but are nonetheless modes of human existence. It is possibly more radical than a phenomenological reduction. So this violent, abrupt appearance of illness, it's uninvited descent into our lives, can also be seen as a way into philosophy, a painful and forced and violent way, but a way not nonetheless. It radically displaces the natural attitude. So we can no longer continue to live as we did when we are ill. It causes ordinary life as we know it to cease and sometimes to entirely disappear and never return. It leads to critical philosophical reflection. It problematizes the relationship to our world, and it modifies the person's way of being and doing. And all of these require not just practical problem-solving ways and engagement, but also existential engagement. Who am I and who can I continue to be now that I am ill, now that I am vulnerable, now that I am helpless, now that I depend on others in ways that are so blatantly different to how I was before previously in health, sorry. So what we see here is that pathology, the removal or the disappearance of normalcy, makes that tacit, taken for granted undercurrent or framework of life as it was before visible. So things we would normally not notice at all, like our digestion, suddenly become visible. So what pathology can do is actually illuminate to us normalcy. Here are some examples of neuropathologies. Being able to only see half of one's visual field, so half of the clock, seeing a hand as a collection of fingers, seeing somebody's entire body as a collection of disconnected body parts. What these kinds of examples demonstrate to us is that normal perception is actually an achievement and not something that we can take for granted or assume will naturally be there. Another example, Matthew Radcliffe has written extensively on varieties of temporal experience in depression, saying there isn't just one experience of temporality that we have in depression. Time can slow down, it can speed up. So that is another kind of way in which pathology illuminates normalcy. And we can also think, this in a very loose sense, that philosophy has lots of pathologies in it. When we think about thought experiments, for example, the brain in a vat, a land of fake barns, other skeptical, thought experiments, what we see in them is really the same thing. We're changing features of normal experience in order to make them pathological and hence illuminate to us a salient feature of that experience. So going back to this idea of illness as a complete form of existence, how is it a complete form of existence, and how does that relate to this idea that pathology illuminates normalcy? Well, our concepts are modified. What is near, what is possible, what is easy, what is light, what is just around the corner. All of these things, all of these concepts, ways of talking and thinking are changed by illness. So people who undergo particular types of experiences will develop their own shared concepts. And maybe what they think of as light or just around the corner is something quite different to what healthy people think of as these things. Expectations change. So again, the taken for granted expectation that my digestive system will continue, my balance will be undisturbed, my speech will be clear and articulated. These expectations can also change. For example, if you live with an illness that is episodic, rheumatoid arthritis, COPD, diseases where you have flare-ups. And when those flare-ups take place, the expectations are obviously completely changed because you have to attend to them. So illness doesn't conveniently pop up when you've got a free afternoon, and your expectations are adjusted to live with a high degree of uncertainty when you're ill in the relevant sense. And again, we readjust so many of our concepts. Just as an example, time and value, what is meaningful, what is worth my while, what is too much effort, what will take too long. So illness as a complete form of existence is nothing short of a comprehensive realignment of the meanings we hold, the values we espouse, and our ways of being. And that amounts to what Husserl refers to as distancing, as moving us away, again, from the natural attitude, from the taken for granted, pre-reflective attitude. So in illness, we have a crisis of meaning. Our life is disrupted. We're detached from the everyday. Our previous life narrative may completely collapse. We might experience anxiety in the Heideggerian sense that arises or, results in a loss of meaning when all the projects we previously would press ourselves into are flattened and we sit outside any particular project because we are no longer able to pursue it. And defamiliarization. What was previously known, comfortable, habitual, is now strange, alien, uncanny. So the epoché enables us to reflect, but without ceasing to be a part of the world. And this is, again, what I think happens in illness. Shared meanings are stripped away, and new light is shed on taken for granted aspects of experience. And I wanted to give an example from the world of art. So this is Rachel Whiteread, and the top image is her work House from 1993. And below we see the Nameless Library in Vienna. And what Rachel Whiteread did is use this technique called negative casting. So if you look at the top image, what you see is not the house. What you see is the inside of the house. So there was a, I believe, a very standard Victorian terrace there that was eventually knocked down. And this was the last house that remained there. And what she did is poured enormous amounts of concrete into the house, which was then left to dry, and then the house around it was demolished. So what we see in this work called House is not the house, but the interior space of the house, the air, the empty space that is usually invisible to us. We say, oh, the room is empty. Negative casting allows us to see the solidity and presence of what we previously took to be empty. I now want to touch on objectification and uncanniness as two characteristics of illness, but also lead to the point I'm trying to make about illness being a philosophical method or a form of distancing. So illness is objectifying in the sense that it puts a distance between self and body. The body is being scanned, x-rayed, placed in a bed, moved around in particular ways for, say, physiotherapy. And we begin to look at our body parts and body systems as functional units that are quite removed from ourselves. This, of course, is reified by medical inquiry and medical interventions that indeed need to objectify the body, for example, in an X-ray image in order to see if a bone is broken. So that's a further way in which the natural attitude towards the body is being broken down, when all of a sudden you think of it as made of cells, containing blood vessels, having a bone in the center of it, and so on. So this objectification disrupts the more common unity, again taken for granted unity, between the body as object and the body as subject. And finally, it replaces the habitual body that is now become problematized, dysfunctional, a locus of pain, a source of many health problems. And here is Jean-Dominique Bauby, who I mentioned earlier. So talking about the first time he saw himself reflected in a glass, the first time after his stroke. So he had a stroke that led to him being in this locked-in syndrome. And it took him a long time to realize what has happened to his body, that he would try to shout or talk or call out for help, but he was simply unable to. Reflected in the glass, he writes, I saw the head of a man who seemed to have emerged from a vat of formaldehyde. His mouth was twisted, his nose damaged, his hair tousled, his gaze full of fear. One eye was sewn shut, the other goggled like that doomed eye of Cain. For a moment, I stared at that dilated pupil before I realized it was only mine. And this is a still from the film, in which the actor portrays portrays Jean-Dominique Bauby in the state of locked-in syndrome, which is quite a stringent acting sort of requirement. So he has this particular facial expression in large portions of the film. The second is, we had objectification, now uncanniness. So the body becomes an obstacle and a threat. It's a source of many negative experiences: pain, helplessness, disability, resignation, surrender, inability, and so on. The Husserlian I can, as our primal attitude towards the world, is replaced by an I cannot, or I once could, but I no longer can. So the perspicuous nature of bodily orientation becomes occluded with attention, not just any attention, but negative attention. And this is what Friedrich Svenius, the Swedish philosopher of medicine, describes as unhomelike being in the world. Which of course brings about it profound changes to the structure of experience and to our experiences of space and time. So I'm near the end, and I want to offer this quote from Arthur Frank, from the opening paragraphs of At the Will of the Body, where he says, critical illness offers the experience of being taken to the threshold of life, from which you can see where your life could end. From that vantage point, you are both forced and allowed to think in new ways about the value of your life. Alive, but detached from everyday living. So this is the Heideggerian formula of anxiety. Alive, but unable to press into possibilities. You can finally stop to consider why you live as you have. So illness is disclosive in the Heideggerian sense. So where does this leave us? I think it's legitimate to say that illness is a unique form of reflection that is contrasted to normal philosophical reflection that is volitional and theoretical, because it's uninvited, it's threatening, it's non-volitional, and it's experienced at the level of the body rather than being purely theoretical. It gives rise to enormous anxiety and uncertainty, which I explore a little bit in a paper called Bodily Doubt from 2013. It's a radical, violent, philosophical motivation, more intimate than abstract philosophical reflection, possibly in some respects more authentic, more demanding, I think its radical nature can be used to sharpen and expand philosophical inquiry. And it can be seen as part of a more general call within philosophy, or phenomenology particularly, for more radical and personal research and exploratory philosophical methods. Illness affects our philosophical concerns, meaning, value, the good life, to name a few, and it lends urgency and salience to philosophical inquiry that may be less urgent and less salient to us in other situations. So, to conclude, philosophy, true philosophy, says Merleau-Ponty, consists in relearning to look at the world. I think what illness does is forces us to relearn to look at the world, and is therefore entirely compatible with the kind of philosophical reflection that, for example, Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists advocate. What I tried to do was to draw these parallels between the Husserlian epoché and illness, and to show that illness can drive philosophical reflection in ways that may not be as volitional and desirable as other cases within philosophy, but in ways that are nonetheless profound and forceful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Javi. This was a very, very impressive and inspiring talk. As we suggested beforehand, we will take a 5-minute break. You just went straight from your other lecture into this lecture, and we return, I'd say, 5 to, so in 5 minutes, and then please, for everyone, prepare your questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and come in. But first, a 5-minute break, and we will reconvene in a bit. Hello and welcome back, everyone. So we now have the opportunity to for some question and discussion. We already have the first hand raised, so it's my pleasure to give the word to Sarah first, and then we proceed. Sarah, please come in.
Hi, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. And I had two very small, I think, questions. The first one is, well, I've been researching the experience of birth for a long time, including the experience of obstetric violence. But even when births are not experienced as violent or traumatic, they can be experienced in very similar ways than the ones you mentioned, with very similar characteristics, or the ones you mentioned regarding disease. For example, this disengagement from, the natural attitude, or this radical reflection on our body embodied experience or subjectivity. So I was wondering if you think that if there can be also, like, I would say positive, I don't want to use the positive thing, but like experiences that are experienced not in a way of suffering or illness, that are embodied experience that can also offer us these phenomenological possibilities. So this is one. And the other question, just regarding the possibility that when we are talking, for example, about severely cognitively disabled people, being a sister of a brother that turned to be demential in a very early stage, with a very rapid dementia, and the possibility of keep flourishing from that point of existence. I mean, I'm searching for it every time. What I think is, it has made us the bystander. So I wanted to ask you about the position of the bystander. Like, I think I have learned so much from his disease about the world, and it has expanded my philosophical horizons too. But is there a situation when you think, I mean, because when you talk, for example, about this severe disability, physical disability of the man, for example, that in the end of the talk that you mentioned about, when cognitive possibilities are there, so I think it's a different scenario, and of course, reflection is still a possibility. But what about when we talk about severe cognitive disabilities and the still possibility to flourish or to exist in a different way? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I actually saw that you're giving a talk on obstetric violence. I just saw it in my inbox a few hours ago. So is that online as well? Okay, so I'm looking forward to that, definitely. So on the first point, the question whether positive experiences can also be disclosive of embodiment or be edifying. I think that's worth considering, certainly. I don't think there's any reason in principle why they can't be, except maybe the following formulation. So I think what happens when you're doing something even very demanding, like sports or, very strenuous workout or dancing or whatever it is that you're doing, and you're pushing your body, you're pushing. I think in some ways you can think of that pushing as pushing from within the limits. You might push yourself to the limit, but not beyond it. Or you might push to expand your limits, the way you do if you run a marathon and you think, oh, I can't go on. And then you find some, inner strength to continue or something like that. But is that enough to destabilize the boundaries? Is that enough to put us into that situation, of what I call bodily doubt, of saying, I'm not sure my body can take it. I don't know enough about extreme sports. It might be that that experience is intrinsic to some forms of extreme sport. This doubt, the sense that I really don't know if I'll be able to complete this course or whatever. But I'm not sure. I think what happens in illness, and maybe this is another difference, is that it throws you into that situation. All of a sudden, you know, your pancreas says, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not making insulin. Or your legs say, I'm not carrying your weight anymore. Or your mouth said, I'm not making words anymore. And I think that is a destabilization of quite a different source. So I think with sports or any form of, you know, bodily discipline, you can pull out, you can say, sorry, I don't want to do this anymore. I thought I wanted to be a champion weightlifter, but I don't. And you stop. But I think in the case of illness, because it's forced upon you, it's a different existential situation. So I think it's quite different in that respect.
In that sense, I think childbirth, it's more maybe like an illness than, but it's, I mean, it's discussable.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm really interested to hear what do you think?
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, I just will say that I use this example about the marathon and all these extreme sports when speaking about childbirth, but because I think in childbirth you have this immanent feeling too, that this is happening to you and you cannot escape. The moment you are there, of course, you can choose not to give birth. Not always you can choose, but if you can choose, you can choose. But if you are there already, it feels like something that goes into you and you cannot escape in that moment.
Yeah,
so in that sense,
that's really similar. That's
yeah.
really similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe childbirth is also a kind of experience that is one of loss of control in that relevant way. I
would think so, yes.
I don't know, we can think about it together and see what comes up.
Yeah.
So I think positive experiences can be edifying, but maybe not quite in this way, simply, again, because they're elective rather than forced upon you. You could pull out of them. Maybe there's other experiences like childbirth that are not disease, are not elected. I mean, you know, of course, childbirth is elected up to a point, but not beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think it's probably a very, very liminal experience in the way that I was talking about illness as being an instance of limit case, being a limit case, sorry. And your second point, can other people learn? Absolutely, absolutely. I think the edifying force of illness is partly in being able to observe, I would say, a lot of virtues, courage, tenacity, overcoming of obstacles, acceptance. There are so many virtues involved in being ill and also to an extent in being disabled. And I think watching somebody else who's close to you cope with those kinds of things and display those virtues can be extremely meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ian Kidd also has a paper, if I'm not mistaken, about illness as an exemplar of virtue. I might be confusing it with another paper, but I think he's certainly spoken about illness being a moral exemplar, which has its own risks, because you say, I'm ill, I'm tired, I had terrible luck, and now also I have to be like Gandhi, right?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's also, we don't want to go there, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, but thanks. These are really, really useful 2 points.
Okay, next, my colleague Oshin Kewan and my colleague Linus Helbach, they're together in the same room, I think.
Hi.
Hi. So thank you very much, Harry. So I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to limit myself to 2. So my first question is, you showed us a picture, a photograph of philosophy classroom, as it were, and you made some points about the similarities and dissimilarities between, if I understand you correctly, the invitation to philosophize from a philosophy classroom versus an illness. And I wanted to push you slightly on that, because I wondered about whether that was a sufficiently nuanced count of what invitation to philosophy is, because I was reminded of, say, the dialogues of Plato, where you've got at least two characters, right, who initiate philosophy in those dialogues, at least two. One is Socrates, famously, and the other one is Xenos, stranger, not a stranger, not a foreigner. The character called stranger, proper name. And it seemed to me like one of the most interesting things about Plato's dialogues, right, is that philosophy can sometimes be, abrupt and violent, right, the way it sends you, and you can't escape it. Like, Socrates is following you, and he won't let you go. He's haranguing you, right? And there's other moments in Plato where it is you can just leave if you want. And so there's sometimes it's gradual, it's habitual, and other times it's quite violent. And so there's basic philosophy and pedagogy of philosophy, and philosophy is as broad as illness. Right? It's not simply similarity or dissimilarity between philosophy and illness in that way. And my second thing was, we were talking about distancing in relation to objectification, and I was thinking of whether you thought that was contingently so, right? That it was contingently so that illness can do this because of our medical institutions and the practices that we follow, or whether it's by necessity. I would favor contingently so, in which case then, that might be highlighted. You might want to focus on that, because I was thinking about, there's an artist called Hannah Rilke, an American artist, who did a work called Intravenous. She plays on the title. It's INTRA -VENUS, and it's about her dying from lymphoma in the 1990s. And it's a series of photographs about her dying in the hospital. And one way of understanding the work he's making from there is precisely as a project of de-distance, contest the medical hospitalization narrative. So rather than it being necessarily so that one is distancing, it can be just, let's say, and sometimes useful one of hospitals, sometimes not useful one, right? When we do that. Does that make sense? Those two questions. And
yeah.
My colleague Adina has also.
Yeah.
Maybe you should
separate them.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'd love it. When you're moving your head, you kind of went in and out of the microphone range, but I think I heard what you're saying. So with the Plato quotes, why do you think it's forced upon you? Why do you think it's can you not just walk away from the dialogue, as it were, or close the book, or refuse to engage, or?
But yeah, some of the characters do want to do that, right? But they're pursued. That's one of the things. That's why Socrates is seen as goddamn annoying to the point that we have to kill him. He won't let you go, right? While in other philosophical dialogues, it's like that. It's like, oh, you don't want to engage, or fine, right? And so philosophy has moved, right, from the point of sometimes it's just polite. Excuse me, I have a point. You want to leave that? To sometimes I'll keep insisting on you, right? And of course, there's political questions with that, right? In terms of like, when do you leave someone off? Do you harangue them to the point of like, you feel that you're being taught by them, right? Which is one way of answering questions. He won't let you go, right?
Yeah, I really like that. Will you email me the reference to the relevant passages? I'm really interested in that. You're right. They call him a gadfly, don't they? They say he's so annoying, they got to get rid of him at all costs. That's really interesting. I haven't thought of that. It might be that there are philosophical texts that simulate or illustrate a similar attitude. I often wonder, some people are, I don't want to over dramatize it, but some people are really tortured by philosophy. I think, Wittgenstein, for example, from the little I know of his biography, was exactly the kind of person who couldn't find rest in the way, I don't know, other people can say, okay, I'm done now, I'm gonna put it aside. So yeah, it might be that philosophy can be psychologically violent in exactly the way, well, in a parallel way to what I was describing, this kind of somatic violence of disease, and force you to change your habits, to not be able to find peace from it. It does take over your life. Maybe there's a great big parallel to be drawn there between particular philosophical texts that have this, I guess, persecutory quality to them. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. And I really appreciate if you email me and I can have a look at the passages that you're, or yeah, just tell me the name of the dialogue. Sorry. Okay. The second point about the distancing, can you say more of what you mean? But can you just speak into the microphone?
So you talked about distancing, and I was uncertain of whether the distancing you were referring to is by necessity, but because an illness is this way, it is distancing, or whether you're allowed for the possibility that the distancing is a contingent, accidental, historical property of the illness.
Right,
namely
right.
something to do with institutions and hospitals and doctors and the way we medicalize certain issues. Because you specifically didn't give the possibility of contingency, but you said necessity, it made me slightly wary, because I do think of examples from the art world, more from everyday life, where you could say the person is trying to reclaim an intimacy with it and not accept it.
Thanks. That's also really, really thoughtful. I think necessity is the right term here, because I think when you problematize the body, when you say, oh, look, my leg isn't doing what it's supposed to. It's always walked when I told it to walk, and now it's not doing that anymore. You change your relationship with that body part or system. I think you can't help but do it. So I don't think it's a contingent feature. And what I think is that it's exacerbated by something that is contingent, which is some types of medical objectification that doesn't have to be as depersonalized and alienated as it is. So yes, it would have these two parts: the necessary part, which is how your attitude towards your own body changes, and the contingent part, which is the medical objectification that isn't necessary and could be treated separately to the first type.
Okay, thank you. I'll let Undina.
I know. Yeah. Okay. So could we? Do you mind if we swap seats?
Audio.
The microphone. Okay. So it's such a kind of interesting project, and my questions are probably also kind of just thinking about its scope and some of its limits or tensions as well. So really struck me the ways that illness and labor overlay with each other. Both perhaps the actual labors that might happen, through illness, but also kind of more just ubiquitous stuff to do with surviving or feeding yourself, or paying bills, and lots of people or caring for children, or people who are also, as Sarah raised importantly, the kind of bystander and the family and the community. And I guess I wonder whether that I do think it's a powerful comparison between a kind of almost phenomenological reduction and some of the kind of discombobulation and provocation to think and value differently that comes from illness. But just like in philosophy, it is a luxury in a sense to have a certain kind of space for contemplation and to articulate what emerges out of a phenomenological reduction, or out of any philosophy conversation. And there've been many feminists, I think Princess Elizabeth and Descartes, who are saying, hang on a minute, that generating that kind of space is a luxury. And I wonder whether, when you're thinking that, I suppose with your account of illness, I suppose I was constantly seeing the complication of some of the exhaustion of labor. And I also immediately, just like Sarah, thought about well, not about giving birth, but about pregnancy. I mean, I naively thought when I became pregnant that I'd write a book about pregnancy and philosophy, and it was utterly the last thing at any molecular level, let alone kind of discursive one, that was possible. And it wasn't that I didn't undergo a discombobulating kind of potentially rich relation, like I predicted that. but there's other conditions that allow for personally, but also communally, the sharing were not there. So I guess I just wondered how that overlays, and I see in a way that that's an issue both for philosophy and for illness.
That's so interesting. I couldn't agree more. I love this idea that labor can be used as a really broad term to talk about. I don't know if you ever feel like that, but I sometimes think being an adult is just so much hassle. I mean, I don't know what your days might be better than mine, but every day I have to do all these things, you know, paperwork and buying food and ordering things online and making sure everybody in my family has what they need, and doing stuff with the, you know what it is. It's sort of, it made me really envious. I went to visit some family in a kibbutz in Israel, where they have this sort of kind of, it's not really, it's socialist light to an extent, but they live in a situation where labor is specialized and everything is collective. Well, not everything, but a lot of things are collective. So laundry, for example, you can just go and drop it off, and there's a laundry place where a few members of the kibbutz do the laundry for everybody. And food, you just go to the dining room and you have food ready for you. And if you need a car to go somewhere, then there's a fleet of vehicles, and you just go and, you know, take one out and use it. And I started thinking, wow, it makes so much sense to not each of us have to do all this kind of, I don't know, people call it life admin, but I sometimes find that it's not life admin because it takes over so much time that it becomes the thing itself almost. So I really like this idea that labor can be all consuming. It's not even, I don't even know to call it labor. I mean, and then also that so much of that stuff is exhausting. And I haven't thought about exhaustion as a malaise, but you're totally right. Exhaustion is just the result of doing this for, I don't know, a lot of years or some years. The caring and the rushing around and the trying to do everything right and pleasing everyone and seeing to your students and looking after your family. And, you know, there's so many things we need to do, as it were, that after seeing that kibbutz, I thought our life is just completely, it's structured in a way that makes us exhausted in exactly that way that you're describing. Now, I think exhaustion also has another feature, because exhaustion, or as it's more normally termed, fatigue, is a symptom in a lot of diseases. And I saw Ellie Byrne is here somewhere, so maybe she'll want to comment specifically on chronic fatigue. But I just had pneumonia a few months ago, and that fatigue, to me, introduced a new dimension of bodily dysfunction, uncertainty, doubt, worry, that was completely new to me, because I never knew you could feel so tired for so long and have no sense of when it's going to lift. So that's another kind of, I guess, bodily parameter that can be skewed in illness. And then as to what you're saying, we don't have good spaces. No, we don't have good spaces in which we can kind of nourish ourselves as philosophers, as people, as mothers, as whatever, you know. And you're also right, I think, that when the body takes over, you gave the example of pregnancy, Sarah talked about giving birth, I gave the case of illness. When the body takes over in that dramatic sense, it's not possible, I think, to philosophize, or I think reflection and going through dramatic experiences like that are not compatible. It's very hard to reflect. You need a lot of time to digest big somatic experiences, I think, of the sort that you're describing. But yeah, I think you know, the ability to even talk about illness as a philosophical topic is a relatively new thing. So yeah, I agree with you that we still have a very, very long way to go. And thanks for this idea of labor, because I don't know if I understood exactly what you're meaning, or maybe my kibbutz example was a bit too kind of tangential. But if I didn't capture your meaning exactly, do come in now and say more about what you meant.
Oh, no, thank you very much. It's been really interesting.
Can you lean in? I can't hear you. Can you lean into the microphone?
Okay, it's been really interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions. I'm going to read one from the chat. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Book wrote, thanks for the great talk. I've recently started a PhD project on the phenomenology of locked-in syndrome, and especially how emerging speech-brain computer interfaces might disrupt their life words and conceptualizations. Something I find difficult to balance between seeing people with locked-in syndrome as subjects with unique knowledge for phenomenological inquiry, and on the other hand, reducing them too much as an abnormal other, almost objectifying them as a different kind of being. How do you approach this balance, also related to your notion of normal experience?
Yeah, thanks. Book, hope I'm saying it correctly. Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, I referred to it a little bit in the talk when I said I use normal to just describe, you know, sort of run-of-the-mill, what's expected, the taken for granted, the tacit. You're totally right that normal should be taken with a big pinch of salt. I think the term normality is sometimes taken to be overly normative or to have a normative connotation. That wasn't my intention at all. It was the contrast I'm trying to draw is between experiences that fall within the broad spectrum of, you know, normal experiences. We don't particularly pay attention to our body in them. The body doesn't garner negative attention and so on. And between experiences that really rupture that taken for grantedness. Then you say, seeing people with unique knowledge, yeah, and on the other, and reducing them too much to an abnormal other. I don't think the seeing them, again, I mean, if we lose the normative connotation of the term normal, then abnormal is also no longer has a negative connotation. So I would say, yes, absolutely, they have unique phenomenological knowledge in virtue of having that lived experience of locked-in syndrome. And, you know, reducing them to abnormal other, I would say, is not at all something that is required from a discussion of locked-in syndrome, as far as I can see. But thank you for it's a good point.
Thank you, Harvey. Ashley Woodward, my colleague, is next on the list. Please come.
Thanks very much for the talk, and I completely agree being an adult is the worst. So thanks for that comment also. So I have more of a comment than a question, but perhaps you might respond to it. And I apologize also, I missed the start of your talk, so I'm sorry if there was anything there that might have already addressed this. So my comment is that this topic reminds me a lot of Nietzsche, and in particular, Pierre Klossowski's strange reading of Nietzsche in his book, Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, where Klossowski does seem to suggest that Nietzsche used his states of illness to do a kind of phenomenological research on the relationship between the mind and the body. But it strikes me that the way that it's presented is somewhat different than the way you presented the distance between the mind and the body in states of illness, where the self identifies with the mind against an objectified body. Because rather bizarrely and interestingly, Klossowski suggests that Nietzsche took the side of the rest of his body against his own brain. And with respect to the questions of authenticity, there's something about this experience that make Nietzsche praise the body and take the side of the body more than most philosophers have done. I wonder a little bit about why that is, but I presume it's because he was in states of illness where his own mind or his ability to think was clouded out by the sensations of his own body. You know, he was in so much pain that he couldn't think. And then it was in those states of recovering from illness that he reflected philosophically on the nature of the mind and the body. And to finish up quickly, what's interesting about this is it inspired philosophers like Jean-Francois Lyotard, who was influenced by the book, to then make arguments against phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty and Michel Dufresne, who he thought posited too much continuity between the body and the mind, with this assumption that there's a harmonious relationship between the mind and the body, which helps us to make sense of the world. So Merleau-Ponty talking about our dialogue with the world and so on. Whereas a perspective like we get from Nietzsche's view on the mind-body relation, the body interrupts the mind and interferes with the habitual sense we make of the world and so on. So I'm sorry, it's a long comment, but I wonder if you've got any reflections on this.
Thanks, that's super interesting. I mean, it's a new avenue of thought for me. It's funny because what I find so powerful, well, not powerful, maybe pleasing about Merleau-Ponty is the third way, is this harmony. And it's interesting to think of it as I don't know, would you say naive or incomplete in some way?
Well, I think, I mean, another thing in the story which might help make sense of this, Lyotard was already thinking about these things before he read Kossowski's book, I think, because of Freud specifically. Mm-hmm. So his concern with Merleau-Ponty and Dufresne is that they don't properly take into account the unconscious and the way that there are things coming from deep within us which disrupt this sense of meaning-making, which seems maybe from a certain perspective to give too much credence to the conscious mind and this continuity that we have between the way our conscious mind processes our perception and our meaning of the world, and then these kinds of disruptions that we experience precisely with states of illness and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there has to be one way of conceptualizing, you know. You might say, well, I think Merleau-Ponty's way is so interesting because he doesn't shy away from pathological cases, right? So he's got Schneider and uses Schneider actually to make a point in general about our relationship to the world, about, you know, the intentional threads that connect us to the world, about our ability to act creatively and, you know, veer away from our normal route to walking home. He talks about a lot of pathologies in phenomenological perception, doesn't he? He talks about anosognosia. He talks about various disorders in a way that's later picked up again, you know, by others. I never got the sense that his approach was impoverished. I mean, in one sense, what you're saying about Nietzsche is clearly correct, right? When your body generates a lot of suffering, I mean, anybody who's had a toothache knows exactly what I'm talking about. So there's no way you can do any thinking, right? It's completely, and, you know, maybe it falls in line with what we were just saying about overwhelming bodily experiences more generally. So the childbirth example that was given, you know, where you just stop, everything else just stops and you just become an animal, really. Panic attacks are another example. Anybody on the Zoom who's got, you know, kind of claustrophobic and got locked in a small I don't know, toilet cubicle or anything, anybody who's felt panicky, I mean, what happens is literally you can't think. And there's, you know, there's good accounts we can give of what happens to the brain in those situations, but I think the point is that reflection is completely switched off and worse. So maybe all of these overwhelming experiences are more in line with the Nietzschean view that you were suggesting. But maybe Merleau-Ponty's account could include aberrations. I'm trying to think. I think it's definitely worth thinking about more. It's quite a new point for me to think about. So I won't say any more, but other than thank you for raising this. It's a very interesting point to think about more.
Yeah, I do think it's a difficult and problematic issue. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to read another question from the chat. Jake Dorothy raised a question. Thank you for a really interesting talk with regards illness as a phenomenological method. I'm wondering to what extent this might be complicated or undermined by the very nature of some illnesses. In some cases of mental illness, for instance, those characterized by delusion, surely there may not be anything akin to a suspension of the natural attitude that lends itself to an increased insight, rather the opposite.
That's a good point. I don't know. I don't know enough about mental disorder to be able to say. I think the natural attitude does get suspended, maybe in some kinds of mental disorder. I think in depression, certainly the idea that the taken for granted way in which you again push yourself into projects and activities is entirely placed in abeyance. I think in anxiety, again, the inability to choose to pursue a project, again in the Heideggerian sense, is also a suspension of the natural attitude. So it might be that some mental disorders or some mental disorder symptoms do allow this suspension of the natural attitude, but others don't. I guess implicitly, paradigmatically here, I'm thinking about slow chronic diseases, where you do have those times where you can stop and reflect. I mean, obviously, what happened to Arthur Frank is that he had a heart attack, but he didn't die of it. Obviously, if you have a heart attack and you die there and then that's the end of reflection. But he had a heart attack and then recovered. But that experience gave him a very profound sense of disquiet with how he was up until that point. And then he also had cancer. I don't remember what kind exactly, but he always talks about how these two experiences were so different and yet both taught him so much about the limits of life. So thanks. That's a really interesting point to try and think about. I guess here you're talking about delusions of symptoms of psychosis as being not suspending. I mean, I would say they still suspend the natural attitude. And the question of increased insight, I just don't know enough about psychosis to be able to say anything meaningful here. If anybody in the Zoom can, please do, if there's any psychiatrists or clinical psychologists.
Thank you, Harvey. Next, it's Lauren Walker, and then I'll take another question from the chat. Please come in, Lauren.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for your talk, Harvey. Yeah, I'm sorry, this might be a bit jumbled. To start with, I was a bit disappointed at the start of your talk when you said, I'm going to limit this just to life-changing illness, because from my intuition at the start, just to the background, my interest is in comparative phenomenology, especially the comparison between Western and Eastern phenomenology, particularly Buddhist. And for me, to limit it just to a life-changing seems to miss a potential strong comparison within the Buddhist context, where, of course, in the crude sense, life is suffering. But I choose to take the notion of dukkha as a more open term, in the sense that it also includes disease or dis-ease as an essential nature of our ability to normalize a self within a world which is contingent. So if you take that and you take that as a grounding place phenomenologically for our relationship to the world, you can perhaps say that we are all in disease, and it is all a chronic disease, and perhaps illness is a materialization, or long-term illness, or the illness you're talking about is a breakthrough. But within a Buddhist practice, the point of a Buddhist practice is to realize that situation is concurrent and continual, and therefore that experience of its all-pervasive nature opens up the gap of reflection and breaks the natural attitude, because in fact it shows the natural attitude to be an illusion. So that's where I go with not limiting your reflection, which I agree with, and placing it as a breakthrough. And if I take that thought in that way, I can then also suggest that, because I'm also dealing with my thesis is also trying to bring the context of my reflection within our particular social context of our failure to deal with climate change and the ecological crisis that we're in. And I feel that in some ways that can be framed also as an illness in a social context.
Yeah.
So, and also that is also illness in a terminal sense that you frame it, in the sense of we're in a life-changing situation culturally at that level, and therefore it's a breakthrough also, but it's also the situation that we're in culturally as far as our cultural disease in the face of our ability to be harmonious participants within a biosphere makes us makes it a kind of the climate change is a breakthrough, just in a parallel to a disease on a personal scale. So I've just blurted out lots of things that came from my response to your great reflection, your great talk there. So I just wonder what your take might be with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dorian. There's a lot there, certainly. So can you say what you mean by breakthrough?
In the sense of, as far as on the socio-cultural sphere of climate change and our collective irresponsibility to that situation, the fact we're not doing anything about it, and the fact that we're facing, perhaps we're facing an extinction event, or we're facing culturally we're facing a change which is being forced upon us, and if we don't actually change our way of relating to ourselves and the biosphere, we are going to enter into more obvious pain and suffering. So it's like one could model that as the start of an illness, and if we don't adjust and change our ways of being, the new reality is not going to be a pleasant new reality. There is going to be a new reality come what may. If we deny that new reality, that would lead to an extinction event for us. And the more we deny it, the more it leads to an extinction event for us. So in some ways, that's a reality which is broken through a situation which has been going on for a lot longer. I mean, certain people like Timothy Morton would say it started with the start of farming. So the illness has been going on for a long time, and that's our normality. So the rupture that's happening is not something that's that something new's happened. It's actually a continuation of an event, a way of being which is hitting the limit of its possibility to continue. So in some ways, one can see disease, one can model disease in that way as well. Certainly for some kinds of disease, in the sense of a way of being which is unhealthy, which ends up in a collapse and a new state of affairs, which the person then has to deal with. And it's a reflection on how they've been before and their new reality. So certainly that's what I mean by an eruption. It is, and that's where perhaps you could see, but also within the Buddhist context, it's often seen that our way of being is like a disease anyway. And it's often said that our psychology in a Buddhist context is like bipolar illness. So
that's so interesting. That's so interesting. There's so much in what you're saying. I mean, on the climate catastrophe, I mean, there's nothing to debate really. You're right. It's it is catastrophically late. Now, as for the Buddhist stuff, I mean, I think the slight discomfort I have about saying we're all diseased, it might be that we are all diseased in the sense that we're all finite, we're all doomed to die, we're all doomed to suffer in our lives. But there is still, I would say, within that, a huge difference between some lives and other lives, right? So our lives are blessed in lots of ways. They might be advantageous in lots of ways, but they also contain a lot of suffering in them, and there's so many unique permutations in which that can appear. You know, I used to always start a new term and look at all the, you know, bright young faces of my students and always just make this quite stupid assumption that they're young and blissfully happy and they've got their whole life ahead of them, and they've got their youth and they're smart and they're students, they're having the best time. And then when they actually come to your office hour as your personal tutees and tell you some of what's going on for them, you realize it's, you know, it's a much less homogeneous. I don't make assumptions about young people, students, or anyone else for that matter anymore. But I do think that there are lives that enable people to do largely what they want. There are lives that enable people to go for a walk without having to worry about their energy levels, about their oxygen saturation levels, about their balance and their gait, about their vision, about being confused and not finding their way home, right? A lot of people can do that. And a lot of people take going for a walk for granted. Those who can't know the value of going for a walk in that pre-reflective way, just saying, I fancy a little stroll, right? And I think it's the same with any other activity, any other thing that we do. What's easy for one person is difficult for another and impossible for yet another. And not just physical activities. I find it quite easy to talk to people I don't know on Zoom. I think a lot of people find this situation, the thing that we do all the time now in philosophy or in academia, would find that really hard. We're all different. Now, but within that context, I don't want to kind of flatten out the differences. I still do have this really strong sense that we're not all on a spectrum, that there is, to paraphrase Susan Sontag, or to use her analogy, the kingdom of the healthy and the kingdom of the ill. And you can't just move seamlessly. It's not like those in the kingdom of the ill can just get a passport and move across. And they are different kingdoms in profound ways. So I often feel hugely sorry for myself about the things I can't do. And I observe I just think it's that some things that other people do, I find miraculous. Being able to, buy an EasyJet ticket for 20 quid and go off to a weekend in another country. Wow, that's, I think a lot of the experiences that ill people are deprived of are ones of freedom, of spontaneity, of being able to do what you want, when you want. Now, there's workarounds, of course. Do they bring back to us the sense of freedom and spontaneity? No, they don't. They're always going to be constrained by the limits of the workaround and by the limits of the ill person. So I think in some sense, I agree that we're all diseased because we're all subject to contingency, to affliction. We're all made up of this vulnerable stuff, these cells and ligaments and bones that are so fragile. But in another sense, especially I think in Western context where people can have a really, really good run of, I was listening today to a radio program about health inequalities. And they were saying, if you're from an affluent part of the UK, you can expect to have a clear run with no health troubles well into your 70s. Whereas if you're from an impoverished, disadvantaged region or upbringing, that is reduced to age 50, right? So those 70 years of clear health, good run, I think that's enormously valuable. It does. I'm not saying that when you reach 72, people should just say, oh, well, I've run out of luck now, but that's okay because I had a really big long run. It's not like that at all. But I think, and I say this because I now have a lot of students with really serious life-changing health conditions. And I see the struggle that's involved in having a congenital disease or disease with a very early onset, and how their life is really demolished by those experiences, by not being able to be part of stuff, by not being able to make plans, by not being able to join in a camping trip or whatever. So I don't think it's a spectrum. I think we have a shared sense in which we're all vulnerable and we're all finite, but I think there's also within that a group, temporary transient group of people who are now healthy and can have that freedom and spontaneity, and then the people who don't have that. And I think it's quite a profoundly different kind of existence. So I guess, yeah, but I don't think it's incompatible. I think you can say stuff in general about humanity as being us being dependent animals, as Alistair McIntyre calls us, being vulnerable and dependent on one another and much more interconnected than we sometimes think. And then still within that to have that further distinction between the healthy and the ill.
Thank you very much. One last question from the
Okay.
chats. Sorry, Laura. No.
It's okay. I was going to come back on that, but that's fine. I can let it go.
Thank you. So Alan raises the following question. Thank you so much for the talk. I had to step away at times, so I apologize if this is something that you addressed over the course of the talk that I missed. But I was wondering if you could speak a bit on whether you believe there's any tension between illness as a phenomenological method when placed in conjunction with the Buddhist notion of acceptance. Is there a sort of balance that ought to be struck between accepting illness as a lived experience versus the danger of allowing acceptance to slip into a sort of fatalism?
Well, that's one for Lauren, really. No, that's very, very appropriate to as a follow-on. Acceptance and fatalism. So I think this is the deal about illness, that you don't really get asked. So you can accept it or not accept it. You're still going to be ill, right? If you have cancer, you can think what you want about those cells. You're not going to make them go away. And I don't mean that in a fatalistic sense. I mean that in a sense that we've been talking about this whole session, really, that our bodies are more powerful than us in a way. Maybe that's kind of what Ashley, in a way, was also saying. Our bodies are stronger than us. So maybe having the right mental attitude or the right response to the challenges of illness, I don't think that involves fatalism at all. I think it involves the cultivation of very significant virtues, like I was saying earlier. Acceptance is a virtue. You know, courage to face the unknown is a virtue. You know, submission to what you can't change, I guess, maybe is a virtue. Recognizing your limitations, not responding in anger. These are all very, very, very hard when you've been dealt a, you know, harsh lot in your own fate. And especially going back to this young people thing, I was just teaching my students again today, and I just saw them for the first time this term. Again, especially when you see your peers going off and doing great stuff, and you think, I can't join in. There's nothing I can do. And even when people, I mean, what we haven't touched on at all is the last phase of what's called active dying, is really the end of life, you know, the last few weeks of life. Where again, no one's asking you to accept, it just happens to you. And the only question I think you can still ask of that particular situation is, what can we do to reduce the suffering? And it's not fatalistic. I'm thinking the Buddhist notion of acceptance. Of course, I don't know anything about the Buddhist notion of acceptance. What I'm using here is just kind of my common sense understanding of what acceptance means more generally. I think not exacerbating your suffering by fighting it is important. I think dealing with what can be changed, you know, so I mean, the reason this is quite kind of close to home, because my father died of COVID and last year, exactly almost a year ago. And at the end of life, it really became about, you know, getting him, you know, to drink a few sips of a new kind of juice that we thought he'd enjoy. Making sure the temperature was right in the room. It becomes, the minute things are the ones that you can control, and everything else is out of your hands. So I don't know if that's a kind of acceptance. Maybe Lauren can comment on that, but I think there's nothing fatalistic about aligning your intentions to the things that you can change rather than the things you can't.
Thank you so much for this, Harvey. I think that was an absolutely amazing session. I think I speak for everyone participating. So thank you so much for being with us virtually. After I think all questions have been raised and more than answered, we'll let you go. And I thank you again for this wonderful paper and the discussion. That was truly something.
No, thank you. I found it so interesting speaking to all of you. I'm just glad Zoom exists so we can do this without being disconnected, you know, until we can meet in person, maybe in another opportunity. But thank you. It was really, everything you said was so enriching and helpful and thought-provoking. I'm really, really grateful to everybody who spoke and who came to the session.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, very specially, and particularly Harvey Carell. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.